Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising on this 7th day of January as we commence the year 2022. Hope you had a good weekend. Today, we celebrate Martin Luther King's birthday, which is a federal holiday in the United States. It's a time each year where we commemorate one of the great lives in world history of the 20th century, an individual who dedicated his life to the liberation of his own people, and through that, the liberation of us all, because to the degree to which any of us are enslaved, all of us are enslaved. And to the degree to which we liberate and free ourselves and people around us and around the world, all of us participate in that liberation as well. So I just wanted to note the birth and life and legacy of Martin Luther King. This has been a theme we've had very often on Humanity Rising as we took in the death of George Floyd in late May of 2020. And the discussions that we've had, not only here, but around the world on the deep question and issue of race. Today, however, we want to turn our attention to another human right, actually, not only civil right, but the right of all of us to inhabit freely and abundantly and healthily life on our planet at a time when industrial encroachment and industrial pollution and political decisions have increasingly been making life here for humans and many other species increasingly problematic because of the infusion of CO2 into the atmosphere. Over 1 trillion tons to date, 30% of which have gone into the atmosphere over the last 30 years or so. We heard just last week that we've had these past 7 years have been the hottest 7 years on record in human history. And at the same time, we heard news reports about the increasing rise of the temperature in the ocean, which is probably because of the scope of the ocean, if not certainly among the most acute tipping points in the world today. We're already in code red, and we have been touching on climate change since the beginning, since the very first day of Humanity Rising, because the pandemic is a result of climate change, at least in part. We spent time in Glasgow for 12 days, last November 1st through 12, where we followed what the governments were seeking to do and then ended up not doing. And we talked to a range of climate activists and climate scientists on a whole spectrum of issues during that time. So we wanted to have a time as we begin 2022 to really look back on 2021 and Code Red and COP26, but then also to look to the future. What does the climate movement do now? What does the progressive movement do now in light of everything that has recently transpired? But before we dive into that very intricate and complex topic, let us pause as we always do. Let us center ourselves in our bodies. And close your eyes if you can and attune yourself to your heart. As our heart beats, the planet's heart beats. And to be conscious of our heartbeat is to bring ourselves into alignment with the electromagnetic pulse of our planet and with each other. Let's just take a moment. And in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving that we're alive at this extraordinary time in human history, let us just be present with ourselves and with each other. Thank you, everyone. Now we'll dive in to the subject at hand, and I want to welcome back to Humanity Rising Rupert Read. You know him. He's one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion. He was a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion during its most animated period in 2018, 2019. He teaches ecological studies at the University of East Anglia in England. He's also the founder of a movement and group around transformative adaptation. And he's really been a globally recognized commentator, I think, in the best sense of that term, as to what's happening in the climate domain, what the movement is coalescing to do about it. It was Rupert that wrote a seminal piece last fall on the imperative for the direct action wing of the climate movement and the moderate flank, as he called it, of the climate movement to come together, because it's only in the spirit and practice of a radical collaboration that we're going to make the difference that we need to make in order to resolve this predicament in which we find ourselves. So Rupert, I want to welcome you back to Humanity Rising. And I want to begin our discussion. I want to ask you, since you were there in Glasgow, just to recollect for us your experience there and the conclusions that you drew at the end, which we aired on Humanity Rising, and now several months later, what your sense of the legacy of COP26 is for the human race as we embark on 2022. But welcome.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you so much for that super kind introduction. So look, the way I'm going to get into the topic you've invited me to speak to, what happened at COP26 and where I'm landing with it, is by way of the other things you've already said, namely the kind introduction to me and the remarks you made about Martin Luther King. And what I want to say is this: I think it's really important for us to remind ourselves quite often that in many ways, when we celebrate Martin Luther King Day, we're not just celebrating the life of one person. We're celebrating the life, which in some respects is ongoing, of a movement, of a mass movement of people. And he was a great leader in that movement who paid the ultimate price in the end. But he wouldn't have been able to do anything without the broader movement around him. And in fact, at some crucial moments, for all his brilliance, he was actually led by the movement more than leading it. I'm thinking, for example, of the crucial point in Alabama with the Children's March, where the movement actually moved ahead of Martin Luther King. So I think that's really important to remind ourselves of, because otherwise on a big day like this, we sort of get suckered into a sort of individualized hero worship. And while it's right to acknowledge the tremendous power and leadership of great individuals like Martin Luther King, or in our own time, I would say Greta Thunberg, it's also right to be very clear that they are, in the end, nothing without the rest of us being there behind them.
Absolutely.
And you know, one reason I'm saying that obviously is because I want to say to every single person on this call, when you hear me and Jim discussing this afternoon, again, you know, it doesn't amount to a row of beans unless you all do stuff about it. We are part of, as Jim said, a historic moment which creates a great responsibility for all of us to be involved in something which is bigger than any of us. And so, turning to your kind remarks about me, Jim, I want to say the same thing about me. In other words, I wouldn't have been able to do pretty much any of what I did in 2019, for example, with Extinction Rebellion, if it hadn't have been for thousands of ordinary rebels, and in fact, you know, 1,000 of them in April and 2,000 of them in October in the UK alone, who were willing to get arrested for the cause. And whether you're doing nonviolent direct action, or whether you're supporting other people who are doing it, or whether you're being part of the moderate flank, which we'll discuss shortly, where the demands for involvement are less high still, although you know they're still demanding, but they're easier for most of us to be a part of in a very real way, and that's part of the reason why I'm putting forward the call for the moderate flank. Whichever of those things you're doing something which is of historic importance, and that's what we need to do. And we all need to step up and be our biggest selves at this point, as part of something which is the larger self that includes us all. So, having said that, turning now directly to your question, I think one thing which was really exciting at COP26 was the mass movement that was visible there, and that had echoes, of course, around the world. And in particular, some of the collaboration between activists in the global north and activists in the global south, which is, I think, more visible at this COP than at any previous COP, and an understanding that people from the global south have to be recognized as an essential part of the leadership of what we have and of where we're going. So in respects like that, COP26 was a really wonderful thing to be a part of, even if for part of the time I was being a part of it from my sick bed. So yeah, things like that made one excited to be there in Glasgow. But I got to tell you, Jim, that the bigger picture was a lot more negative than that. You'll recall, and perhaps some people who are listening here today will recall, my warnings in summer and October and into November 2021. My warnings that the COP was going to be a fantastic disappointment, that it was going to completely fail us. And I'm afraid I have to tell you that my warnings proved prophetic. The deal that came out of COP26, in my opinion, was a fig leaf. It was useless. And the things that are hyped as progress, I don't really see them as significant progress at all. The language around coal is pitifully weak. It's not even English. Phase down. They're going to phase down coal. And what does that even mean? It literally doesn't mean anything. The move, which a lot of people said was really exciting, around moving to annual targets for emissions reductions for countries, I didn't really see that as very exciting at all, because it's still the same basic game, which is kicking the can down the road. Does it really make that much of a difference if you kick the can 1 year down the road or 5 years down the road? So people say, oh, COP27 is going to be really exciting and important. I'm kind of like, oh, for goodness sake, we've been here 26 times now. Do you really think COP27 is going to be significantly different? So we are in a very bad place. And turning now to what that meant for me personally, I'll tell you what it meant for me personally. I came back from Glasgow, and I was better physically pretty much by the time I got home. I was over my convalescence. but mentally was a different story. It was such a strange thing, Jim, because, you know, more than most people, I'd been saying, you need to have very low expectations of this COP, people. It is not going to deliver. It is not going to deliver what we need. It's not going to deliver what you hope for. So I went into the thing with virtually no expectations. The shocking thing was, though, that I still found that even with virtually no expectations, I was still deeply disappointed and wounded. And why? Well, because it was yet another really big marker on the road to perdition. The COP26 needed to be the moment when everything started to shift, because it was the post-Paris COP, because it had been delayed by a year, because it was the COP that was going to set us up for the post-COVID reset. But it just didn't. And even though I was virtually certain that it wouldn't, the fact that it didn't was still devastating. So what happened to me when I got back to my home here in rural Norfolk in the east of England, where I'm speaking to you from, what happened to me was that I went into a real depression for a few days. I've suffered post-COP depression, and it wasn't pretty. And on, I think it was the Wednesday after COP, I was really in a terrible place. I was thinking absolutely constantly about the situation. I couldn't focus on anything, or couldn't focus on anything else. And I've been in that situation before, but it was a particularly intense version. I think the intensity was because of the intensity of the experience of being at COP. So yeah, so I dealt with it. You know, I coped with it. I went through it. What else can you do? I experienced it, and I tried to learn from it. The main thing that I think helped me was that I spent some time speaking to one or two close friends and colleagues that day and the next few days, and just sort of being with them and speaking with them and speaking it through in the kind of way I'm doing with you now, really, although it's retrospective now. That was very helpful. And within about a week after that, I was kind of more or less back to normal. But, you know, I say back to normal, it's a bit like the situation with climate, or the situation with COVID for that matter, generally. There really isn't any kind of back to normal, because what I mean when I say I was back to normal, what I mean was I wasn't kind of in this kind of pathological, depressed, desperate state of constantly focusing on how difficult the future is likely to be because of the way that COP26 has failed us. But I was still aware that it had failed us, and that this is another step down the road that we do not want to go down. And our task is even harder now than it was before. So it sort of never kind of completely goes away now. You know, it's always kind of just kind of there on the edge somewhere. And what do I do with that? Well, you know, I try to turn that into energy, and try to make sure that my response to it is the kind of response that at some level we all need to be a part of, which is what I was talking about 5 or 10 minutes ago, that this is a prompt for us to step up as we never have before. And it is a prompt for us also to let go of expectations which are not going to be helpful anymore. You know, every year that goes by, every COP that fails, etc., we are further from the potential for a smooth transition. We have to be readier for the kind of things that are called for in the programs of transformative adaptation, and for that matter of deep adaptation. And we have to get more serious about our response, about naming the reality, about telling the truth, because there was a lot of fake news, if you will, around COP. There was a lot of fake kind of optimism. That has to be punctured. That's what I'm writing about at the moment. How do we go to the next level in terms of truth telling and being able to face this situation, and being able to break through to waking more people up about it in the way that we need to, because I still firmly believe that that is the most central element to the path that we now need to take. So yeah, that's my response to your question. It's a pretty full response. I hope you'll agree. I hope it's useful to people. It's really just coming from the same place again of honesty, and thinking that if we are honest about these things, and honest with ourselves and honest with each other about where we're at, about what we've got to let go of, about what we're going through, about what we can still aim for, about what we're going to do about it, That is our greatest potential. That is the key to the successes that have been enjoyed so far by organizations like Extinction Rebellion and the School Climate Strikers, and is going to be ever more key as we move forward into the 2020s.
Well, thank you so much, Rupert. And I must say, I went into a depression as well. I even though you know something's going to fail, when it actually does, it hits your heart at a level of kind of desperate, almost a loneliness that there's the lights are on, but nobody was home. And so I just want to say,
and that's why it's important to share it again. Yeah,
and people all over, I'm sure we're going through the same thing. But let me ask you a question or two about the COP, because I read an article that was very interesting about the evolution of the demographic at the COP, from governments and scientists, civil society, to COP26, which was really dominated by lobbyists and people from the financial industry. The largest delegation there, even bigger than any of the national delegations, was the fossil fuel lobby, with hordes of financial analysts and representatives of financial institutions. And I'm just wondering, since you've been at a number of the COPs and you've seen the evolution, how would you characterize, from sort of the government institutional point of view, the hardening of the refusal to take it seriously? Because they're clearly 26 years on, they're listening to the same data we are, but closing down and manipulating the situation more and more cleverly. So speak to us just a little bit about what you observed about how they were doing what they were doing.
That's a great question, Jim. Thank you. My take, though, is slightly different from yours. The number of fossil fuel lobbyists there was indeed very concerning. But actually, my understanding is that quite a lot of fossil fuel lobbyists were not allowed to be there, and the situation on fossil fuels was probably, in fact, better than it's been in the past. The thing which I think has got worse is that, in a more sort of general sense, the COP has become more dominated and influenced by corporate voices, by big finance, etc. And that it's harder probably than it ever was for NGOs, civil society, etc., to make a difference inside the COP proper, if you will, inside the actual negotiations space. To illustrate that a little bit, let me tell you something about what it actually felt to be like at COP, at the venue. It didn't feel good. It really didn't feel good. It wasn't the kind of place, and I'm not just alone in saying this. I said to a number of my friends and colleagues who were there, are you enjoying this? What does it feel like to you to be in this space? And whenever I asked that question, typically they would reply something very similar to how I was feeling. People were mostly sort of rushing around, looking very, very self-important. There was a lot of the kind of actual space felt like a sort of corporate exhibition space or something. There was very little space for radical reflection or challenge. There was very little space for anything of a spiritual nature, like what we had at the start of this evening here. It wasn't the kind of space which was conducive to what we need, which is fundamental reflection on the paradigm, really kind of facing up honestly to what's going on, figuring out what we're actually going to do about it, honest, deep expression of emotions. It was hard to find spaces for those kind of things in the COP. It was possible. Some people did it. I certainly did it. And I'm proud of the contributions that me and my team made at the COP. Those were really good events. And I went to one or two other things which were really worthwhile. For example, hooking up with a few monks from Plum Village, Thich Nhat Hanh's space in France, who were there. That was very powerful. But this was very, very much the minority. So the thing was too much like a sort of corporate trade fair. And also in terms of the sort of media agenda and so on, I think another thing which is quite concerning is that as well as having this sort of meme of corporations are going to save the planet, or big finance is going to save the planet, which Mark Carney kind of bought into in a rather worrying way at the COP. There was also the kind of celebs are going to save the planet kind of vibe going on in a way which I think was, is pretty implausible and not very helpful. There were an awful lot of celebrities there, not necessarily inside the actual COP itself, or some of them were, but they were sort of around, almost kind of partying and so on. And none of this kind of, you've obviously some celebs like Leonardo DiCaprio are really trying to do the right thing at the moment, and fine, good for them. Don't Look Up has been, probably more of a kind of positive game changer in many ways, certainly than COP was. But you see what I'm getting at, that to the extent that COP was a space where governments in a narrow sense, plus corporations, big finance and celebrities were dominating quite a lot of the action, that combination is just not going to give us what we need to come out of that kind of thing. So, this is one reason why I've been very forthright since COP in saying we need to ask really hard questions here, like, should there be any more COPs? Is this system fit for purpose at all? Should we continue to put any faith in it? And a lot of what the kind of the impetus for the moderate flank that you and I have talked about before, Jim, is actually the quite radical, in a way, idea that, well, maybe we have to do a lot more of this ourselves. Maybe we have to think, actually, there's a limit to the extent to which we can reasonably expect now governments and international organizations of the kind of treaty nature of the COP to step up to the plate. The evidence is that they're just not doing it. So that means there's less excuse for us not to, and there's something empowering in that.
Well, that's where I wanted to go next. If it's clear that after 26 attempts, the governments and the powers that be are, for whatever sets of reasons, refusing to take realistic action, that means there's only one option left, and that's the people. That's the movement. And so that's what I really want to explore in this conversation today, Rupert. And I'd like to kind of start at the beginning in the sense of, was there any qualitative difference in the discussions you were having with other people in the movement? You mentioned that there was more interaction between the global South and the global North.
Yeah.
But was there any strategic discussions among the principal groups? The governments are not going to solve this, guys.
Yeah.
So that means we've got to do something that's qualitatively different in order to somehow make a difference. Because you're asking the right questions. The question that I have is, how is the movement answering the questions in a qualitatively different way such that it makes us more effective?
That is another great question, Jim. And I've got to tell you that I do have some concerns on that front. I wish there had been more of that at and around COP. In my experience and to my knowledge, there really wasn't very much. I think that, let's think about this, for example, in terms of the youth movement. So the youth presence at Glasgow was very substantial and inspiring. And at the same time as pointing to the increased role of global South leadership in relation to the crisis in which we find ourselves, I think we should say and acknowledge, I think this was clear in Glasgow, an increased role also for youth leadership. But and this has been said before, it's really wrong for us to put too much of this on the youth. It's wrong that they sort of have to kind of shame those who have a lot more power than them into action. It's a tragic thing as well as a wonderful thing that you've had the youth strikes for climate. And it's unfair, and Greta herself has said this, for us to expect that young people who are just finding their way in the world can really sort this out and kind of provide sort of full spectrum strategic leadership, that's just not a reasonable expectation for somebody who in many cases is still at school and so on. So on the one hand, we have to acknowledge the fantastic role being played by the youth, and we have to allow them, and I think there was a sense of this being, allowed and encouraged at Glasgow to have an increased role and an increased voice. I was very proud, for example, at Glasgow to host a panel inside the COP, which was aired on COP TV, where we had some youth climate strike leaders and others in the youth movement from around the world there present, speaking about their experience. It was incredibly powerful. But like I say, to expect that folks like that are going to be able to have the power and the expertise and frankly the experience to know exactly what to do and how to actually get the results they need is implausible and is asking in many ways too much. Mm-hmm. So there needs to be real strategic thinking. There needs to be thinking, for example, about how much can be achieved by marches, how much can be achieved by sort of standard oppositional strategies. My own view is that the answer to those questions is, well, not very much usually at the end of the day. We have to think with deep intelligence, learning from history, learning from recent experience, joining up with each other about what we can actually do that works. And obviously, I've been trying to offer what thinking I can on those fronts over the last few years. This needs to be done at every level. So I would say to people on this call, for example, those kinds of conversations need to be happening here in Humanity Rising. They need to be happening in smaller groups on the internet. They need to be happening in person too. They need to be happening in local communities, at the state level, if you're talking about the United States, at the federal level, at the level of a nation. And internationally, and obviously we're to some extent having an international conversation here today. They need to be happening at all those levels because the venues, if you will, to struggle in are various and different. And it is a mistake to think something like, oh, the only thing that matters is global action, especially given how little we can rely on global action for the reasons we've already discussed. It is a mistake to think, oh, well, the nation, the state, the federal level, that's got much more power than everything else. So we should be just focused on influencing that and forgetting about the rest. No, just because we can't expect there to be delivered by states or by federal institutions as much as needs to be delivered, we've got to try to make stuff get delivered at other levels. So I think I want to emphasize very much, and this is what I've been doing in my writing recently, trying to provide a bit of a strategic lead, the great importance of thinking about what can be done in our workplaces, the great importance of thinking about what can be done in local communities, or what can be done through local government or perhaps state government, where potentially it is easier to successfly campaign than if you're talking about the federal or national level, let alone internationally. So in a way, what I'm saying is, let's have proper strategic thinking across these levels, and let's have proper strategic thinking within each of these levels. And in many cases, of course, that's going to mean that, again, if we're talking about who's actually listening to this conversation, many people here are or should be or potentially have the capacity to be leaders in this. If you're somebody who knows more about or has thought more about these matters in your locality or even your state than nearly everybody else, well, that provides you with a potentiality and a responsibility to step up and do something about it. So to give a practical example, thinking of the radical flank, if I was in the United States right now, one of the things that I'd be thinking in relation to the Sunrise Movement or Extinction Rebellion or what have you is there a way in which we can achieve some kind of success in one state or another, which could be a model? So rather than thinking, what can we do to influence Joe Biden, for example, thinking about whether there is a state or more than one state where there could be a focus on that as a place to really achieve something and really move the envelope, shift the conversation. And one reason for thinking that way is that if you did have a concentration on one state, perhaps it would be California, perhaps it would be Vermont, then that might provide you with the potentiality to be a focus for people in other states as well. And thereby you could increase your potential leverage and your chances of actually achieving success. It's a little bit like thinking about if you think about campaigning in a federal presidential election, there's the concept of battleground states, right? States where it makes more of a difference if people campaign in those states than in states where the outcome is almost predetermined. Well, you could think of it in terms of the climate movement. Are there the same things? Are there, if you will, battleground states which could be won? Are there battleground states, battleground localities, battleground firms, workplaces, particular industries where the movement that we know and the movement that we're trying to build could actually achieve success? That's the kind of thing which I think is meant at this time by real strategic thinking. I don't think, frankly, there's been nearly enough of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that you say this, because last week we had David Gershon on, and he's been a climate activist for many, many years, and he's managed, Rupert, to raise a pretty significant amount of money and get the city councils of Los Angeles and Irvine and Petaluma to commit officially to be carbon neutral by 2030. And he's raised $1 million in cash and another $1 million in kind to support them in this endeavor. And if you know his book, Social Change 2.0, it's really about how you build a movement from the ground up, neighborhood by neighborhood. But he's interestingly come out at the same place you have, is how do I make a difference in a place where, if the difference was made, could lateralize and scale to other cities and other places around the world. So that's an example, I would say. And several people in the chat talked about Bill McKibben. He's now moving from 350.org to Third Act to empower seniors. There's citizens assemblies that are out there. So I think there's a lot going on. And I know you're working on transformative adaptation. But before we get to those array of challenges, I want to, since you're one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, and we had Roger Hallam on a week or two after the COP, and his view was nothing less than massive millions of people on the street will suffice. His view is that what David Gershon or Third Act or citizens assemblies or XYZ are pointless given the gravity of the crisis and the rapidity with which we're spinning out of control. So he comes down saying we need massive social mobilization and obstruction of traffic, normal operating conditions, and people have to really rise to that stark realization, or they're not taking the climate crisis seriously. So where do you come out? Because you've been on the inside of Extinction Rebellion. Where do you come out on that?
Yeah, well, and thanks for, I think you may have been alluding to this book of mine, Extinction Rebellion Insights from the Inside, which people can find easily on the internet, for example, at eJunkie, where you can get it on a gift economy basis. So yeah, I've got obviously a pedigree in this. I helped launch Extinction Rebellion and have strategized within that organization and around it for quite some time. Had many conversations, obviously, with Roger. He and I are actually having a dialogue very soon, actually, which will address this directly. So that could be quite interesting. My perspective is significantly different from his. In some sense, in principle, I agree. I think that what would really be needed to make happen the kind of thing that we need to make happen, the kind of very rapid transition that is what in an ideal world one would want, would be absolutely unparalleled levels of nonviolent direct action, orders of magnitude larger than what we've seen so far, even in the UK. It would still have to be cleverly, strategically articulated, to go back to the previous question. I think that some of what Roger has led on over the last couple of years has unfortunately not lived up to that standard. Recently, for example, Insulate Britain, which blocked motorways in the UK and to some extent one or two other countries, I think achieved very little except a great deal of unpopularity. But yeah, if we could have absolutely vast, intelligently, strategically directed nonviolent direct action, that would be fantastic. My judgment, however, is that that is unlikely to be the case for the next year or two, at least. You might say that's defeatist. I would say it's realist. Extinction Rebellion in the UK is calling for millions to be on the street in April of 2022. I hope that will happen, but I will be absolutely amazed if it does happen. So I think we have to ground ourselves in.
Let me just stop you right there,
yep.
Rupert, because I think this is an important point of your analysis. What's the difference now from, say, the fall of 2018, when Extinction Rebellion really made an impact? What's changed? Has Extinction Rebellion changed, or has the objective situation changed? Why are you pessimistic now in ways that you were not in 2018 about the efficacy of direct action?
So, look, I think it's important to remember that Extinction Rebellion, its successes in 2019 were achieved with numbers that were, yeah, they were mass numbers. It was brilliant how many people we got onto the streets, how many people we got willing to be arrested. But they were orders of magnitude short of what was necessary to actually win our demands. So what happened in April 2019 when Extinction Rebellion experienced the success that it did in the UK, success in seemingly permanently changing public consciousness, which is fantastic, and success also in facilitating Parliament declaring a symbolic climate and environment emergency, the government legislating for net zero carbon, Parliament creating a climate citizens assembly, albeit not one with enough powers. And of course, the net zero target was way too late. Those elements of success were achieved with only, I say only, and it's a lot, but only 1,000 people arrested. What Roger is saying is that we need millions. I mean, that's orders of magnitude different. We need millions of people to be willing to go to that kind of level. That's what I'm skeptical about achieving. But also, I would say, yes, it's also true that Extinction Rebellion has changed a bit since then, and not, in my judgment, entirely for the better. It's become a little bit more focused on identity politics. It's become a little bit angrier in some of its rhetoric. All of this is, in a way, understandable. Certainly anger is understandable. And we're seeing a lot of anger among the youth climate strikers, frustration, completely understandable. But it's not clear it really helps us achieve our objectives unless it gets funneled in the right direction. And also, and this might be the most important point of all, you can't do the same thing twice, You can't, the great philosopher Heraclitus said a long, long time ago, you can't step into the same river twice. And speaking as a philosopher, there's a sense in which I think he was wrong. There's also a sense in which I think he was right. There's a sense in which you have to be aware
the constant flow of whatever you are in and of time itself. Extinction Rebellion was able to achieve what it did in the UK in April 2019 because it hadn't been done before. But now it has, and it's moved the envelope. And you can't carry on doing the same thing. So if there's going to be mass nonviolent direct action of the XR kind in the UK, it's somewhat different in other countries which haven't experienced it so much, then it needs to be much larger, as Roger says. I just don't think we're at the point where that's going to happen. I think what could be a lot larger is what we're calling the moderate flank. I think there are now millions of people who really want to do something, and they want to do something that's adequate to the occasion, but they don't think that's blocking traffic. They're not necessarily willing to get arrested. They're not necessarily signed up to a woke identity politics agenda. I could go on. We need to be building a movement that is genuinely inclusive, that has room, obviously, for a radical flank pushing the envelope, and that has loads more room for I froze.
That in order for Extinction Rebellion to really move forward, it's got to be reinventing its tactics as well as its strategy.
Yeah, that's right. And something which is interesting to watch in 2022 is Roger's latest innovation, which is called Just End Oil, which I think will be more strategically intelligent than Insulate Britain, because it makes more sense to people to target the oil industry than it did to block motorways. And I think that Just End Oil could be a successful element of the radical flank in 2022. But I believe strongly that the only way we're going to reach the millions that we need is if we lower barriers to entry in the way that I was trying to describe. Make it so that people don't think they have to be arrested. So they don't think they have to be an activist even. So they don't think that they have to sign up to a certain kind of political agenda in order to take seriously and sufficient climate action. So that's the essential motivation for the moderate flank. I think that Roger is wrong to think that it couldn't succeed. I think that if it happens at scale, it could succeed, and I think it could happen at scale. Whereas I think that for the next couple of years, it's unlikely, at least, it's unlikely that we're going to see radical flank activity happen at the kind of scale that is really needed. I'm in agreement with Roger that we need those millions. So we need to think about how we actually enable them to get involved.
Yeah, I think in terms of my conversation with Roger, I think his central point is if you really take in the gravity of what's going on, pouring out in the streets is the most appropriate and efficacious response. But I think people still need to be educated about the gravity of the crisis in which we find ourselves. I think most people aren't acting simply because they don't understand
exactly
how bad the situation actually is.
So that takes us back to the fundamental importance of truth telling. And central to the moderate flank approach is that there's nothing moderate about sort of the diagnosis. There's nothing moderate about kind of what you're saying about the state of where we are, etc. Not at all. What's moderate is only that relative to, say, Extinction Rebellion, one is allowing a greater inclusivity of folk in, and a greater inclusivity, if you will, of targets, and thinking that let's try to kind of make stuff happen directly through workplaces, through communities, etc., where the route through government and states seems to some extent blocked. Yeah, I passionately believe, as I said at the start, that until we get a deeper and wider truth-telling and therefore a wider waking up, we don't really have a prospect of achieving all we need to achieve. And a crucial part of what we need to do, therefore, is get people to understand, as you just said, Jim, how very vulnerable they and their families and their children and their communities and so on now are. And that's, you know, a crucial part of the work I've been trying to do over the past couple of years, trying to tell this, what we call sometimes the vulnerability story. And it does work best as a story of what could happen, as to what's happening right now, as to what has happened recently where climate disasters have hit and so on. The story of how fundamentally vulnerable we are and our civilization is and so on, and seeking through that to wake people up until that story has landed a lot more. I think it is pie in the sky to think we're going to get millions on the streets willing to be arrested on climate. But as we kind of make progress with this truth telling, we can get a lot more people. I think already a huge number of people, especially perhaps in the wake of COP26, are willing and able and anxious to know what to do to meaningfully get involved and meaningfully do something. So it's about offering, if you will, a sort of menu of options to include really, really serious potentialities in terms of slightly less demanding actions. One more thing, given that I started this by saying that I agree with Roger, that in theory, in principle, that what should be happening is millions of people should just be pouring onto the streets in absolute kind of outrage and tearing the government down and putting something better up instead, and creating citizens' assemblies and so on and so forth. And given that, unlike Roger, I'm very skeptical that that's about to happen, there is another implication here, which is that it increases once again the importance of adaptation, because the reality is that we are already in a period of incipient climate breakdown. Our weather is spinning out of control. I'm sure that virtually everyone on the call, virtually everyone listening to this is well aware of this. Not enough of the world's population are really aware of it yet, but that awareness is spreading and we can spread it more. One of the best ways to spread it is by actually saying that we need adaptation and that we need transformative adaptation and that we need it now and that we cannot wait, and getting on and doing some of it, because that brings home to people the reality of the crisis. That brings home to people their vulnerability. Oh, so we actually have to prioritize right now preparing for, you know, the next mental hurricane, off the scale, flooding, you know, whatever it's going to be, completely record trashing, heat dome, etc. Yeah, we have to prepare for it right now, because these things are happening right now and they're going to carry on getting worse for a very long time. If we take adaptation seriously, we make this thing psychologically more real, and we protect ourselves. And we have to do that because it's too late to prevent disasters. Disasters are here, and worse disasters are coming. So one slight danger of Roger's approach is that by sort of emphasizing, look, we need to get everyone on the streets, we've got to deal with the climate emergency, we've got to kind of take care of this terrible situation, that might distract attention somewhat from the adaptation work that we need to do. And that, as I say, will be seminal in changing people's perspectives, in changing people's minds and hearts on this issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. Gene Stevens just put something in the chat that reminded me. We had Antonio Nobre last week, the great climate scientist out of Brazil that's been involved in the Amazon, and toward the end of the discussion, which was brilliant in terms of how much he knows about the ecology of the Amazon. I asked him, so if you had to recommend one thing that we could all do to stop this, what would it be? And his immediate answer is, we need Nuremberg trials. We need to name the crime and punish the offenders. And I was rather struck for a climate scientist to be so clearly, radically clear about what needs to be done. And so I wanted to, you know, when you talk about truth telling, Rupert, and and adaptive responses to the climate crisis.
Yeah.
What would you say to Antonio Nobre's assertion that we need to really speak truth to power at the level of Nuremberg-like trials for the crimes against humanity that are being perpetrated right now by the corporate and political elites?
Fascinating. So look, I agree that such crimes are being committed. I think maybe it is a key part of truth telling. It's a wonderful, stimulating suggestion. Maybe it is a key part of truth telling to say that and to call for something like this. However, if what he's saying is we need those actual trials to take place now, I do have to say in response, well, that's not going to happen, right? Such a trial is not going to start next week. It's not going to start next month. It's not even going to start next year. So what I'm trying to do, and I do think this is a vital element of any genuine strategic thinking, is not just to talk about what in some ideal world ought to happen. You know, it's no good for us to propose a sort of climate utopia and then say, and here's the utopian method for getting there. No, the method for getting wherever we're going to get, whether that's utopia or anything else, has to be a method which can actually be practiced. Now, of course, I agree that it's possible for things that seem impossible to happen remarkably quickly. You know, that is a key lesson of the last few years. The reason we created Extinction Rebellion was to make what seemed politically impossible possible. And to some extent it succeeded. But there's a difference between that and sort of pure fantasy politics. If somebody says to me, next week, we're going to put Exxon and Shell on trial, and I don't just mean we're going to have a sort of, mock show trial. I mean, we're actually going to put them on trial. My response is, you're simply in some kind of fantasy world. That is totally not going to happen. A lot of things would need to happen before we got to that point. So I'm interested in those things and making them happen. So among those things are, we have to tell the vulnerability story better. We have to get people thinking and talking and doing a lot more of adaptation. And the adaptation has to be the right kind of adaptation. It has to be transformative plus deep. And we have to do more general kind of truth telling. We have to land a lot more what's happening. We have to get people to understand just how much is at stake. As we do those things, then we can build a much bigger and more effective mass movement, right? And that will include radical flank elements. In my opinion, it will include also huge moderate flank elements if it is going to succeed. We have to do all that, and then it seems to me we get in a position to maybe do these kinds of things somewhat down the line. So I could imagine, for example, if we are smart and serious and lucky, and we build movements that are orders of magnitude bigger than the movements we have at the present time. And I think that will, by the way, include something like Bill McKibben's Third Act. I've been talking with Bill a little bit about this, and I think he's really onto something there. I think the generational aspect is really important. Kind of comes back to what we were saying before about children. The sort of flip side of children is the old and their responsibility. If we do all that kind of thing, and we really get serious about it and build it over the next few years, then maybe in, I don't know, 2026 or 2027, maybe by then we get to the point where we can actually have some real Nuremberg-style trials of corporations. And that's a brilliant thing to aim for, but it's not the kind of thing that happens overnight.
Yeah. Well, he was making the point that there's 100 corporations that produce 70% of the CO2, and that we're now in a world where there's a climate disaster doing at least $1 billion in damages on the average of every 18 days. And so I think he's expressing, as is Roger, out of an awareness of the urgency, what should be done. And I think you're answering that in the appropriate way, that we need to distinguish between what would ideally be done in a world that doesn't currently exist, and what we can actually do in terms of small concrete steps with more and more people getting involved in whatever way that's appropriate to them. And within this regard, direct action, we're all taking direct action one way or another when we're either speaking truth to power, or we're doing a sit-down demonstration, or we're writing a blog, or we got Los Angeles City Council to agree to go carbon neutral by 2030. So I think what you're doing is you're expanding the notion of direct action, and only when that reaches a critical point, a critical mass, will the other things that we want to have happen actually occur.
Absolutely.
Is that essentially what you're saying?
Totally, Jim. And it's really important. I want to underline what you said when you said I'm expanding the notion of direct action. The thing which I find really exciting, actually, about the moderate flank idea, and what I think helps it to resonate with what a lot of people want, increasingly all over the world, and certainly in countries like the UK and the US, is that it's about not just saying the government ought to be doing X, or what really ought to happen is Y. It's about saying we're going to do it because they're not doing it. And that is direct action, right? It's about saying, what if we moved into our workplaces and our local communities and whatever else we're kind of seriously involved in? You know, you could have the same argument through religious organizations, for example. What if these organizations, what if these institutions actually took this thing seriously and started to deploy a full spectrum response? What if, let's take an example, what if the firm or the profession that you work in, say the law, or the manufacture of carpets, it doesn't really matter, although there are different opportunities and dimensions to whichever it is. What if in that firm of yours, or to put it a bit larger, in that institution or in that profession, people were not just thinking but acting on, okay, what is our product? Is our product harmful or not ecologically? What does our supply chain look like? Is it resilient? Is it low carbon? Are people unnecessarily commuting to work? What is our trade organization doing? How are we lobbying the government? Are we lobbying for tax breaks, or are we lobbying for a higher playing field for everybody, for eco action? What is our brand identity doing? Is it trying to encourage people to consume more crap, or is it trying to encourage people to actually be good global citizens? What are we doing with our profits? Are they making a few people rich, or are they being invested to actually make the world a better place? And those are a load of big things that I just named, but of course that's not even the end of it. There's more. If we had people in every workplace, in every firm, in every institution, in every profession, asking those questions and not taking no for an answer, and pursuing them through their professional association, or through their trades union, or through even more direct action, that would have, and if that was happening all over the place, and if people could see it happening all over the place and get the feeling, because people are often kind of like, oh, what difference does what I do make? A good answer to that question would be, look, what you're doing is making a real difference here, and there's people doing it there and there and there and there and there. If people could see that and feel it, and be part of something that was bigger than them, but that was starting from where their lives were in their workplaces, and I'd make the same argument for local communities, and we could go through other kinds of important aspects of our lives. I think that had incredible power. And of course, if it really started to happen, and it is starting to happen, and I give examples of that in what I've written about this already and in other talks, if people could see it really starting to happen, that of course would influence governments as well. That would influence politicians and so on as well. So it wouldn't be like you just forget about them. No, of course, governments remain incredibly important. But this is a way you could really kind of influence them. If you're like, oh, wow, they're actually doing it there. God, that's embarrassing, that they're doing it and that we're lagging behind. That's why I think Roger is wrong in thinking that this method is inefficacious. I think it's
probably about the best chance we've got now, although I think it should be, of course, joined up with other kinds of political thinking, and with a kind of general kind of movement ecosystem, which includes radical flank elements, which will surely be important in the future. I mentioned Just End Oil, which could be a good candidate, and for all I know, there'll be brilliant campaigns of sabotage or ecotage in the future. I wouldn't rule out the importance of those. But what I'm saying is, right now, if we were to do these things, if we were to get more serious about radical truth telling, if we were to tell the vulnerability story better, if we were to get serious about adaptation, and if we were start to do all that and do the things which are necessary in our workplaces, in our communities, etc., that would be direct action. That would be a certain sense in which, if you will, you could see the moderate flank as being more radical than the radical flank. Actually doing it, actually making it happen, not saying you other powerful people make this happen.
Right. Well, good. You mentioned, just so our audience can feel inspired, what would be some examples of what you're calling for?
Yeah. So I'm going to speak mainly from my experience in the UK. Some of the small but growing and already to some extent influential organizations that I'm thinking of. So there's an organization called Lawyers for Net Zero. Lawyers for Net Zero, existing mainly in the UK at the moment, is bringing together in-house lawyers who want to achieve climate action through their firms. Another example would be the Climate Emergency Centres movement, which has begun in the UK and is now spreading abroad. And climate emergency centres are sort of one-stop shops for mitigation and adaptation. And they've got this brilliant model which works particularly well with the UK property and zoning and so on. I don't know if there's something similar in the States, where they get properties for free from the local council that the council do not want to see remaining vacant and potentially going derelict. And they get them for free and they turn them into these climate emergency centres. Other examples would be transformative adaptation itself, Mothership, which is a sort of post-activist organization of obviously mothers trying to kind of do what they can do with that identity. Another one would be Wildcard, a sort of unconventional new NGO in the UK, which is trying to encourage the royal family to rewild their lands. And the intriguing thing about all of these organizations is that they've all been founded by people who used to be major players in Extinction Rebellion. So this is what I'm saying, that actually,
fantastic.
All the ones I've named, there are quite a lot of people who were in XR who are thinking, what's next? And maybe what's next is not, as Roger says, something more radical than XR, but something less radical than XR, that therefore has the potential to bring in far more people.
Yeah. Well, there's a woman named Jeannie saying that she's a climate activist in her company and has gotten the company to reduce CO2 emissions by 60%. So well done, Jeannie. You should be in touch with Rupert and let him know more.
Brilliant. Yeah. Yes, do. Yes.
As we bring this to a close, Rupert, I want to delve now into first the distinction that you would draw, just so we're all clear, between mitigation and adaptation. And what do you mean by transformative adaptation? Because I think, Paul Hawken is just coming out with a major book on regeneration. We've launched the Global Regeneration Corps. There's Regeneration Costa Rica, and regeneration now is becoming a meme. You call it transformative adaptation. Let's talk a little bit about that. But first, distinguish between mitigation and adaptation for the community.
Yeah, thank you. So those are kind of technical terms in the climate world.
they're not the most brilliantly designated terms, but they're the terms we've got. So mitigation, what it means is basically greenhouse gas reductions. Adaptation, what it means basically is coping with the effects of us not having done enough greenhouse gas reductions, i.e. coping with climate damage, coping with disasters, becoming resilient. The question that arises with regard to mitigation, with regard to adaptation, a question which has occupied me a lot in the last couple of years is, okay, so how are we going to adapt? What form is that going to take? An awful lot of the talk about adaptation to date and an awful lot of the action on adaptation to date has been incremental adaptation, or is it sometimes termed more critically or negatively, shallow adaptation. This is the kind of adaptation, for example, that Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, has recommended. He jumped kind of neatly from being he and his party jumped neatly from being climate deniers to saying it's too late to do anything about it to stop it, so forget mitigation, but we will adapt. And what they mean by adaptation is things like building higher seawalls, building higher levees along rivers, etc. Those things aren't necessarily always bad, but if that's all you do, then what you're trying to do is, in a carbon-heavy way, shore up a system that is not going to be shored up, a system that is fragile, brittle, and heading for the rocks. So we need some other way of thinking about adaptation. And the way which was first really put forward by some elements of the United Nations and then developed by a few academics, and then my think tank Greenhouse in our book Facing Up to Climate Reality took it further. And that has been at the core of quite a lot of my work over the past couple of years. Transformative adaptation is about saying it's not enough to defensively, incrementally, shallowly adapt. We have to adapt in a way that leads to system transformation as much as possible at the same time. And we have to adapt in a way which is itself low carbon. And we have to adapt in a way which is pro-mitigation, rather than undermining mitigation. And we have to adapt in a way that works with nature rather than against nature. So what would be an example? So a good place to start would be if you're thinking about floods and adapting to the greater floods which there are going to be in the future, then, well, how about if you think systemically and look at changing farming practices upstream and in the immediate area that you're talking about, how about rather than necessarily just building higher and bigger flood defenses, hard flood defenses, how about you look at restoring or possibly even creating wetlands, or in other parts of the world, mangrove swamps, and looking about how those can be compatible with human flourishing and can actually lead to better lives. So that's a sort of thumbnail sketch of what transformative adaptation would look like. I think it is essentially now what we need. And as I say, it also has the wonderful benefit that by taking adaptation seriously in this way, you actually change mindsets so people understand more and more how vulnerable they are and understand the kind of thing that we need to do in order to start to overcome that vulnerability.
Now, your organization, Transformative Adaptation, tell us a little bit more about it, and what issues or what projects are you personally focusing in on?
Yeah, so Transformative Adaptation, the actual organization, is quite nascent and small. It's mainly what we're trying to do is engage in thought leadership and helping others to take transformative adaptation seriously. And those others would include climate emergency centers, they would include government where possible. They include anyone who's willing to listen, really, because this is a kind of this agenda of transformative adaptation. It's not going to be something that gets done by one organization or even by one movement or one coalition or anything like that. It's a kind of complete different way of seeing what we need to do to get serious about resilience and, yes, regeneration in the era that we are in. And it's a way of making sense of it that fits into the schema that applies to, going back to where we started, what organizations like COP are doing, but really radicalizes it. You know, one of the best things that the UN could do would be to really take transformative adaptation seriously and place it far more centrally in processes like the COP negotiations. We're not going to hold our breaths for that to happen. So it's about trying to kind of show some thought leadership, and hopefully it's going to lead to stuff on the ground, which makes some of it happen. I mean, transformative adaptation is, if you will, it's sort of a sort of successor to, or a sort of complement to, permaculture, agroecology, agroforestry, the transition towns movement. It's kind of positioning those in terms of where we are at now in the era of anthropogenic climate damage, and seeing kind of how to go forward on that basis.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Rupert, once again, you've been so enlightening, and because it feels to me that having been part of this conversation, that you're really urging all of us, whoever we are, wherever we are, and whatever we're doing, to make climate action a priority in whatever way that is comfortable, but whatever way we can actually move the dial in either a company or a neighborhood or a profession, however that is. And that's for us to decide, and that it's all direct action. And then more fundamentally, with transformative adaptation, to do whatever we're doing within the context essentially of biomimicry. How do we take whatever action we're going to take, but do it in alignment with natural systems and in a way that rejuvenates the ecology and rejuvenates a human community? Would that be, it's a rough generalization, but I think that the essential points that you're making.
This is why I love to have these conversations with you, Jim, because you're just so sharp and so tuned in. You know, once again, you've summed it up beautifully. And in terms of, the implications for individuals who, wherever they are around the world, watching this and putting fascinating stuff in the chat and so on, I would say it's about thinking about where you as an individual potentially have the most leverage, and be certain that where you potentially have the most leverage is not just by acting as an individual. Where you potentially have the most leverage is certainly with other potentially like-minded people. But yeah, that may be in your profession. It may be in your workplace, it may be in your local community, it may be through some organization or institution that you're a part of. But take seriously what you can potentially do through that, and take seriously, therefore, your own potential for leadership, or at the very least for really seriously acting collectively, such that together, or with the help of inspiring others, whatever, leadership can be accomplished. For some people, it might be a question, maybe there's someone wealthy watching this, someone who has $100,000, hanging around in a bank account. If you're such a person, then it may be that the most leverage you can have is by putting that money to work, and doing it before it becomes worthless, which is what will happen if we start to get civilizational collapse. It's potentially different for every person, but take seriously your potential leverage points, and then apply them to the moment, apply them to the climate and ecological emergency. Of course, it's never just as narrow as climate, which is always already incredibly wide, but there's even wider stuff than that. And to thinking about it, as I say, and as we've discussed, not just in the context of mitigation, but also crucially in the context of adaptation. Adaptation is going to become a watchword in the 2020s, where tragically we're going to be grappling with climate and ecological decline. And the sooner we get ahead of the game on adaptation, on building resiliency, the better. So yes, Jim, you've summed it up beautifully, and it's really a pleasure to have these spaces.
Thank you so much, Rupert. You've inspired us with deep truth, but also you've illuminated a powerful pathway forward that all of us can take in whatever way the Spirit guides us in that regard. So thank you so much, my friend. Hope to have you back down the trail for updates from the front line. Thank you, everybody. That'll bring our session to a close for today. You're welcome to join our after chat group. Stan has just put the link in the chat box, and we'll see you here tomorrow for a discussion on the natural resilience of our bodies. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Rupert. Bye for now.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.